Good morning to you and thank you for staying with us. This is the South African Morning. Now, September is Heritage Month and this morning we delve into the history of coloured people. My guests, Tessa and Lynsey, Ebony, Chutel, have penned a book titled Coloured, and it looks into the life of coloured people as descendants of indigenous Africans, their identity and our history has shaped their race. Ladies, so good to have the both of you here. And I was saying, so is this what the two of you do when you spend time together?
Apparently so.
Clearly, writing books, apart from the fabulosity of the work that you're doing in the spaces. But how did this book actually come about? Let me start with you, Tessa.
So in the year 2020, we had the death of Nathaniel Julius, who was murdered by the police in Eldorado Park, become quite a national story, if anyone will remember. And during that period, we were working around, issues in the community generally, but also on that story. And I found myself having to answer a lot of questions in the media space around why coloured people are angry, why coloured people are doubling down on, their own identity in this moment. And I was a bit surprised that people didn't understand that. I was surprised that people didn't get why coloured communities particularly had that sense of disenfranchisement. And so we were asked by the publisher if we would write something. And it was a really difficult decision to actually make because, it's not something that you can be so far removed from. We are both from Eldorado Park, and so we needed to take on something that would be able to not just, talk about coloredness in an abstract way, but talk about it in a grounded way for ourselves and for our community.
Which brings me to my next question, Lynsey, an incredibly personal journey, because I think when you're asked now to speak on behalf of the coloured race and, two ladies from Eldos, and now this huge responsibility being put on your shoulders, how was the journey for you, Lynsey, and how did the two of you approach this body of work?
So from the get-go, we were pretty clear that this was not going to be an academic exercise. There has been written, mountains of what it means to be coloured in South Africa, the heritage of the Khoisan, etc., enslavement. But what we wanted to do was to focus on the stories of real people. So on the cover, my favourite part of this book is that those are real people. Those are real lives that we spoke to, because we wanted to have a breadth of the coloured experience from the Cape to Limpopo, and so that there are multiple ways of being coloured. So it's less about taking on the responsibility and more about platforming these stories. And these are stories that coloured people talk about at the table. Sometimes they don't even talk about it. Some of these are whisper stories. We found things out about our own families. Tessa's father, for example, and she'll tell you more about that. I found out about how my family came to northern KwaZulu-Natal as part of the Great Trek and people who were enslaved. And then just those stories that we whisper and stories that we don't hear enough about. And so that's what that is. It's not on our shoulders. It's more of a conversation starter. That's what we hope it will be.
So just really giving people permission to explore themselves, to explore their background and explore their history. Do you mind sharing what it is that you found out about your dad, Tessa?
Yeah, so writing this book meant asking my own family about our own experience of colouredness. And so I've always known that my family, from my father's side particularly, has a mix of Motswana heritage in it, and so I was curious how my father ended up classified coloured. My father speaks Setswana, for example. A lot of the family speaks Setswana, so I was like, how did this happen? And his story was about, as a 16-year-old at school, being taken on a very perverse class trip to the registration offices for classification, presenting there, as he knew himself, a Motswana-speaking boy with the cultural norms he had, and his name, Lesole Dooms, and then being classified as native, going home and finding out that, as many coloured families did at that time, that the family had decided to classify coloured, which meant making decisions about how to show up at that registration office.
And how was that decision made and why, do you know?
So the decision was made by the elders. I don't think my father knows why the decision was made. But the consequence of the decision was that he needed to go back to the classification office and present with an English name, Elliot. And that was the last time he legitimately could use the name Lesole. So growing up, I knew my father's nickname was Solly, but I didn't know that it was Lesole. Wow. I didn't know it was connected to that name until my father was 79 telling me the story while we were writing this book. And so the story, his story is told as a story that helps us understand what colonialism, slavery, and apartheid did to the lives of coloured people.
Sorry, Tessa, and you mentioned, Lynsey, that these are the faces of real people. And I think when you spend time with real people, they bring you a guess, their heart, their soul, their history. And so you see that mirrored in the stories that are contained in this book. It also brings me to the question then of coloured as something political or cultural, which is something that both of you actually, speak to. Talk to us about the difference between coloured being a racial classification versus what you view it as a cultural expression.
Yeah. So we see it particularly as an ethnic expression. So, for example, we say that we are ethnically coloured but politically black. And what that means is that our ethnicity, our culture, our language, the way we do things is coloured. In the same way, for example, that someone might be ethnically Zulu and still politically black. What we mean by politically black is that there is a shared experience of black people not only in South Africa but across the continent and across the world, for example. There's a shared experience of oppression. There's a shared experience of fighting and rebelling against colonialism, enslavement, apartheid, segregation. And so in that sense, we all share a history. And so when we say politically black, that's what we mean. And we want people to know, for example, because there's this division, and it's a false division. So we understand why the apartheid government created the coloured identity. It's because it was an economic arrangement at first, where it was just seen as a more easily exploited form of labour, because these are people who came from the enslaved. And so they felt that they would be cheaper labour. And so then we see, and also just that they wanted to separate them from the so-called natives to weaken the group. And so what we're saying is, look at the person across the road, from Noordgesig to Orlando. Look at the person from Manenberg and Cooks.
One community.
Exactly.
Sometimes you literally have to wait for a person to open their mouth.
To know exactly,
to know,
precisely.
okay, so where do you fit in? Are you coloured? Are you black?
And does it matter
and
that
does
much?
it matter
That's
that
the question
much?
we're asking.
And what you mentioned here, which I think is quite important, is the reasons why it was important for the apartheid government to put that classification to actually separate black from coloured. But then we also cannot fly over the fact that there is some mixed race within the coloured community. And so how do you deal with that? There's the Africanness, but then there are also, quote-unquote foreign nationals, colonizers who came through, and thus an extension of the coloured race. Do you want to comment on that, Tessa?
And that's not true for all people who've been given the name coloured, right? So being of mixed heritage or mixed descent, let's not call it heritage, call it mixed descent, having lineage that is white and lineage that is black and African. That's some people in the coloured community's journey towards this classification and this community. For other people, like people in the Khoi and San communities, for them, part of the indigenous peoples of the country in many different ways don't have that sense of we're coloured because we're mixed. We're coloured because at some point a lazy colonial system and a lazy apartheid system decided that anybody that had a skin that now looked like the mixed people, just creating that and taking away from those people who had full sense of culture, their own name and their own culture, and then bestowing on them coloured in a very violent way as well. So we also know that not everybody accepts the term coloured, right? And especially people from Khoi and San communities, because they know that that was a taking away of their culture.
And own identity.
Exactly.
So it's not homogenous. You can't say coloured and it's one blanket covers all.
Absolutely.
I love the titles that you've used for the chapter. You've got Aware Massacant. You have got Kerksuster or Straatmeis. Or mates, and then you also have Heiskos. So you really get into, literally with Heiskos, I can literally just smell what this chapter is. Like literally, was that the intention?
That is exactly
for us to feel like we want to have like some cook sisters or something, or whatever gets cooked. But Tessa, just before we wrap up this morning, there's a chapter that says no. Trevor Noah isn't coloured.
Oh, this is going to get us into so much trouble.
Let's go there this morning, Tessa.
But it's actually about that question of classification, right? And denouncing the idea of colouredness as a race. Somebody asked me this week, where do you tick on the boxes and all of that? And for me, part of the idea that coloured is on those boxes of races is problematic, because race is about biology. And coloured people don't have this shared biology anyway. But what we do have is culture. So just because somebody has a mixed biology doesn't mean they share in the culture. So in the same way, I can't just rock up and say to a community of Zulu people, I'm Zulu. They're going to ask me cultural markers. They're going to say, do you speak the language? Do you know the customs? Are you familiar with the way of life of Zulu people? And do you live it? That's the same thing for colored people. And so Trevor Noah might have mixed biology, but he doesn't necessarily have the community experience of colored culture, and that's the distinction we make.
It's very nuanced.
It is.
Classification is nuanced. Identity is nuanced. That's what I'm getting from this conversation. Thank you so much for this book. I cannot wait to ravage it. And I see you've got some pictures as well. Interesting pictures. People with pigtails and ponytails and afros.
Yeah, it's precisely the whole hair journey, food journey, the works.
Thank you so much, ladies, for joining us. And thank you for penning, I think, this book that is really going to span generations, because I think we did need something, in our time. For future generations. There's the post-apartheid, there's apartheid, and there's post-apartheid, but where are the voices of this generation and what